The sound of shattering glass echoed through the marble lobby of the Grandeur Hotel, as Margaret Whitmore stood frozen, her perfectly manicured hand still raised from the slap she had just delivered. The delivery boy stumbled backward, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Around them, a crowd of wealthy diners paused mid-conversation, their designer clothes and glittering jewelry creating a sea of judgment and curiosity. Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and merciless, each word dripping with contempt that made even the onlookers wince. "You people are all the same," she hissed, her perfectly glossed lips curling into a sneer that transformed her beautiful face into something ugly and cruel. "You think you can just waltz into places like this, touching things with your dirty hands, breathing the same air as us, expecting to be treated like equals." Her father's restaurant, the crown jewel of their family empire, had always been her kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. The delivery boy, no older than 20, clutched his torn sleeve where she had grabbed him, his face burning red with shame as tears threatened to spill from his eyes. He had committed the unforgivable sin of accidentally brushing against her white Chanel dress while carrying a stack of supply boxes through the service entrance, leaving the faintest smudge of dust on the pristine fabric. Margaret had erupted like a volcano, her fury disproportionate to the tiny mark that could easily be wiped away, but it was never really about the dress. It was about power, about reminding everyone in that room exactly where they stood in the hierarchy she had built in her mind. The boy opened his mouth to apologize, but before he could form the words, a deep voice cut through the tension like thunder rolling across a summer sky. "That's enough, Margaret." The entire room seemed to hold its breath as heads turned toward the entrance, where a man stood silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming through the glass doors. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the delivery boy made in 6 months. His dark eyes burning with an intensity that made Margaret's heart stop cold in her chest. She knew that voice, knew it better than her own heartbeat, and hearing it again after 5 years of silence felt like being plunged into ice water. Robert Chin stepped forward, each footfall deliberate and measured, and when their eyes met, Margaret saw something in his gaze that terrified her more than any anger could. Complete and utter indifference mixed with disgust. 5 years ago, Margaret Whitmore had been a different person. Or perhaps she had simply been better at hiding who she truly was. She had been the golden girl of Riverside University. The kind of beauty that made professors stumble over their lectures and students crane their necks in hallways, just to catch a glimpse of her passing by. Her family name carried weight, old money that stretched back 3 generations of successful restaurateurs who had built an empire from a single noodle shop into a chain of upscale dining establishments across the state. Margaret had grown up in penthouses and country clubs, her childhood memories painted in shades of champagne wishes and caviar dreams, never wanting for anything except perhaps genuine connection. Her mother, Catherine Whitmore, had raised her with very specific lessons about the world and their place in it. "There are 2 types of people in this life, darling," she would say while brushing Margaret's long dark hair before bed. "Those who serve and those who are served. We are the latter, and you must never forget that." Margaret had absorbed these teachings like a sponge, letting them shape her worldview until the divisions between people seemed as natural and immovable as mountains. But then came the autumn of her sophomore year, when everything she thought she knew about herself began to crack and crumble like old paint peeling from a wall. Robert Chen had transferred to Riverside University that fall, a scholarship student from the other side of the city where the buildings were shorter and the dreams somehow seemed bigger because they had to be. He was studying business and working 3 part-time jobs to keep himself afloat, his days a brutal marathon of classes, shifts at a convenience store, tutoring sessions for wealthy students who paid him to do their homework, and weekend hours at a moving company where he loaded furniture until his muscles screamed. Margaret first noticed him in the library, always in the same corner seat by the window, surrounded by towers of books and empty coffee cups. His concentration so intense that he seemed to exist in a separate dimension from everyone else. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with expensive haircuts or designer clothes, all sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His quiet intensity drawing her attention again and again, until she found herself choosing seats closer to him, pretending to study while actually watching him work. For weeks, they existed in this strange orbit around each other, never speaking but always aware, until the day she witnessed something that would change the trajectory of both their lives. It was a cold October afternoon, rain hammering against the library windows, when 3 members of the university's most exclusive fraternity cornered Robert in the stairwell. Margaret had been on her way to meet friends when she heard the commotion, the cruel laughter and mocking voices that made her pause with her hand on the door. They had him backed against the wall, these boys she had grown up with, gone to the same preparatory schools and summer camps, their faces twisted with the particular ugliness that comes from privilege meeting resentment. "Hey, scholarship boy," one of them sneered, pushing Robert's shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. "Heard you've been tutoring Sarah Henderson. She failed her midterm anyway. Guess being poor doesn't just mean you're broke, it means you're stupid too." Margaret stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Robert's jaw tighten, his hands curling into fists at his sides even though they all knew he couldn't fight back without risking his scholarship. His future, everything he had worked so impossibly hard to achieve. The boys moved closer, smelling blood in the water, ready to push further, when Margaret's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "That's enough." They turned to look at her, surprise flickering across their faces, because Margaret Whitmore didn't intervene in these things. She was one of them, born into the same world of casual cruelty disguised as social hierarchy. But something in her face made them step back, some steel in her spine they had never seen before, and after a tense moment where the future seemed to hang by a thread, they walked away, muttering about bitches and mood swings. Robert looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for something she didn't understand, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled, not grateful or relieved, but genuinely amused, as if he found the entire situation darkly funny. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low and smooth like expensive whiskey. "I can handle idiots like that." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, suddenly defensive. "I know you can," she snapped. "I just didn't want to listen to their noise anymore." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Robert nodded anyway and gathered his books, preparing to leave. "Wait," Margaret called out before she could stop herself, surprising them both. "Can I buy you a coffee? As an apology for them. For existing in the same world as them, for benefiting from the same system that tried to crush people like him." Robert studied her for another long moment, and Margaret had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. The coffee turned into 2 hours of conversation that felt like 2 minutes, sitting in the campus cafe while rain streaked the windows, and the rest of the world faded away. Robert talked about his dreams of building something from nothing, of proving that success didn't require a trust fund or family connections, just intelligence and determination and the willingness to outwork everyone else. Margaret found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, her fears of being nothing more than her family name, her suspicion that most people in her life only cared about what she represented rather than who she actually was. When they finally left, the rain had stopped and stars were beginning to peek through the clouds, and Margaret knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. Their friendship grew slowly, carefully, like a plant reaching toward sunlight through cracks in concrete. They met for coffee between classes, studied together in quiet corners of the library, shared meals at cheap restaurants. Robert knew about where the food was good and the prices were better. Margaret learned about his world, the immigrant parents who worked 16-hour days at their laundry service, the younger sister he was putting through high school while paying his own tuition. The bone-deep exhaustion that came from never being able to rest because rest meant falling behind. Robert learned about her world too, the suffocating expectations and hollow relationships, the way money could buy everything except genuine connection. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from you but never wanted to know you. Somewhere in those conversations, friendship transformed into something deeper, more dangerous, and absolutely inevitable. Their first kiss happened on a Tuesday night in January, snow falling softly outside the library where they had stayed past closing, getting locked in by accident and having to call security. They were waiting by the door, laughing about their situation, when Robert reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek, and Margaret stopped breathing. When their lips met, it felt like coming home to a place she had never been. Familiar and brand new all at once, and in that moment Margaret knew she was completely, irrevocably in love with Robert Chen. They kept their relationship secret for 3 years, hiding their love like contraband in a world that would never accept it. Margaret told herself it was temporary, that once Robert graduated, and established himself professionally, once he had achieved enough success to meet her family's impossible standards, they could finally be open about what they meant to each other. But deep down, in the parts of herself she refused to examine too closely, she knew the truth was far more complicated and infinitely more cowardly. She was afraid, terrified actually, of what choosing Robert would cost her, the inheritance that would be cut off, the family that would disown her, the social circle that would freeze her out like she had never existed at all. So they lived in shadows and stolen moments, meeting in his tiny apartment across town where the heat barely worked, and the neighbors were too busy with their own struggles to care who came and going. Sharing meals cooked on a hot plate and dreams whispered in the dark. Robert never pushed her to go public, never demanded she choose between him and her comfortable life. But sometimes, she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something sad and knowing that made her heart ache with guilt she couldn't acknowledge. The beginning of the end came on a rainy Thursday in April, 3 months before their planned graduation. Margaret had stayed over at Robert's apartment, something she did more frequently now despite the risk, waking up in his arms feeling safer and more herself than she ever did in her family's mansion. She was making coffee in his cramped kitchen, wearing one of his old shirts, when her phone rang with her mother's number flashing across the screen. Margaret's blood turned to ice because her mother never called this early unless something was catastrophically wrong. She answered with trembling fingers, and Catherine Whitmore's voice came through the line, cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Come home immediately," her mother said without preamble. "We need to discuss your future and the lies you've been living." The phone went dead, and Margaret stood frozen, the coffee pot still steaming in her hand, while Robert emerged from the bedroom asking what was wrong. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only shake her head as panic clawed up her throat because somehow, impossibly, her mother knew. The drive to her family's estate felt like a funeral procession, each mile bringing her closer to a reckoning she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. Robert had offered to come with her, to stand beside her and face whatever was coming together, but Margaret had refused with a vehemence that hurt them both. "This is my family, my problem," she had said, words that created distance between them like a physical wall. "I'll handle it and call you later." But the look in Robert's eyes as she left suggested he knew better. Knew that when she walked out his door, she was walking toward a choice that might destroy them both. Her mother was waiting in the study, standing by the window with her back rigid and her hands clasped behind her like a general preparing for war. Beside her sat a private investigator Margaret had never seen before, a nondescript man with folders full of photographs that documented every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, every moment of happiness Margaret had tried to hide. Her mother turned slowly, and the disappointment on her face was worse than any anger could have been. "How could you?" Catherine whispered, her voice shaking with genuine pain beneath the fury. "How could you throw away everything we've built? Everything you are? For some scholarship student with nothing to offer but empty dreams and poverty?" Margaret tried to defend him. Tried to explain that Robert was brilliant and hardworking and kind. That he loved her for who she actually was rather than what her family name represented. But her mother cut through every argument like butter, her words carefully chosen weapons designed to hit where Margaret was most vulnerable. "He's using you, darling. Can't you see that?" Catherine said almost gently, as if explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. "Boys like that, they see girls like you as meal tickets, golden opportunities to climb the social ladder without doing the actual work. You think he loves you. But what he really loves is what you can give him. The connections. The money. The easy life he'll never have to struggle for again." Margaret shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face, insisting her mother was wrong, but Catherine just smiled sadly and opened another folder. This one contained financial records showing every time Margaret had given Robert money. Small amounts at first for textbooks and groceries. Then, larger sums, when his sister needed medical care or his parents' business faced unexpected expenses. Presented like this, clinical and transactional, their relationship looked exactly like what her mother was describing. A systematic extraction of resources, disguised as romance. The final blow came when Catherine revealed her ultimatum, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who held all the power and knew it. "You have 2 choices, Margaret. Break up with this boy immediately, completely, and return to the life you were meant for. I've already arranged for you to marry Daniel Morrison, the son of my business partner, a young man from our world who understands the value of family legacy. You'll have a beautiful wedding, a position in the family business, and everything you've ever known will continue as it should. Or," her mother's voice dropped to something colder than Margaret had ever heard before, "you can choose Robert Chen, and leave this family forever. No inheritance, no trust fund, no safety net of any kind. You'll be cut off entirely, and I promise you, Margaret, when the money runs out and reality sets in, when you're struggling to pay rent and watching your friends live the life you gave up, you'll realize your mistake. But by then it will be too late, and these doors will be permanently closed. You have until tomorrow morning to decide." Margaret left that study feeling like she was drowning, her entire world collapsing into an impossible choice between love and security, passion and stability. The person she wanted to be and the person she had been raised to become. She drove aimlessly for hours, her phone buzzing constantly with messages from Robert asking if she was okay, where she was, when they could talk. She couldn't answer because she didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to explain that everything they had built together was crumbling and she was seriously considering letting it fall rather than fighting to save it. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like the world was burning, Margaret pulled over in a parking lot and finally let herself break down completely. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, cried for the future she was about to lose no matter what choice she made, cried because she already knew deep down what that choice would be. The next morning, Margaret went to Robert's apartment, wearing the armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup, her face a mask that revealed nothing of the agony beneath. He opened the door with hope in his eyes that died the moment he saw her expression. She didn't let him speak, didn't let him touch her. Because she knew if she did her resolve would crumble and she would choose him, and they would both end up resenting each other, when poverty and struggle replaced passion and dreams. Instead, she delivered the speech she had rehearsed all night, each word carefully selected to cut deep and make him hate her, because that would be easier than having him understand and forgive. "This was a mistake, Robert," she said in a voice that sounded nothing like her own, cold and dismissive in a way that made him physically recoil. "I thought I could do this. Could be with someone from your world, but I can't. You're dragging me down, holding me back from the life I'm supposed to have. My mother was right, you're just a poor student with big dreams and no way to achieve them, and I refuse to sacrifice my future for someone who will never be able to give me what I deserve." She watched his face crumble, watched pain replace shock and then finally settle into something harder, something that looked almost like relief mixed with devastation. Robert didn't fight for her, didn't beg or plead or promise to change. He simply nodded once, his jaw tight, and his eyes suddenly empty, and said quietly, "I understand. Thank you for at least being honest about who you really are." Then he closed the door. And Margaret stood in that dingy hallway listening to the sound of her own heart breaking, wanting desperately to knock and take it all back, but already walking away instead. She went home and told her mother she would marry Daniel Morrison, went through the motions of engagement parties and wedding planning while feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. She never saw Robert again, never knew that he had left the university 3 weeks later. Never learned that he had taken his broken heart and transformed it into fuel. Working harder and longer than ever before, until success became inevitable simply because he refused to accept any other outcome. And Margaret never told anyone, not even herself in the quiet moments before sleep, that she had made the wrong choice and would spend the rest of her life paying for it. The weeks after the breakup passed in a blur of numbness punctuated by moments of sharp, breathtaking pain that left Margaret gasping like she had been punched in the stomach. She went through the motions of her engagement to Daniel Morrison with mechanical precision, smiling at the right times, saying the appropriate things, playing the role of the happy bride-to-be while something vital inside her withered and died. Daniel was handsome in the way wealthy men often are, tall and well-groomed with the confident bearing of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. He was polite to her in public, attentive in the calculating way of someone performing for an audience. But in private moments, Margaret caught glimpses of something colder, beneath the charming surface, a sense of ownership rather than partnership that made her skin crawl. Her mother was delighted with the match, already planning a wedding that would be featured in society, magazines, already counting the business opportunities that would come from merging their families. Catherine never mentioned Robert again, acting as if those 3 years had simply been erased from history, an embarrassing phase that Margaret had thankfully outgrown. But Margaret couldn't erase the memories, no matter how hard she tried. She would wake up reaching for Robert, her hand finding only empty space and expensive sheets that suddenly felt suffocating. She would catch herself starting to text him about something funny she saw, her fingers hovering over his contact before remembering with fresh agony that she had destroyed that connection with her own hands. The worst moments came late at night when she couldn't sleep, lying awake in her childhood bedroom that now felt like a gilded cage, wondering where Robert was and what he was doing. Whether he hated her or had already moved on, whether she would spend the rest of her life comparing every moment to what she had lost. Her friends noticed something was wrong but attributed it to pre-wedding jitters, offering reassurances about cold feet being normal and marriage being an adjustment. They didn't understand that Margaret wasn't nervous about marrying Daniel, she was mourning the death of the person she had been with, Robert. The version of herself that had been braver and kinder, and more real than the hollow shell she was becoming. 3 months into her engagement, Margaret saw Robert's name in the university newsletter that still came to her family's home. He had won some prestigious business competition, his face smiling from the grainy photograph, and Margaret stared at that image until her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. He looked different, somehow, harder and more determined. The softness she had loved, worn away by whatever he had endured after she broke his heart. The article mentioned he was taking a semester off to pursue a business opportunity overseas, and Margaret felt panic claw at her throat because he was leaving, disappearing from even the possibility of accidental meetings. And once he was gone, she would never get the chance to explain or apologize, or tell him the truth about why she had said those terrible things. She picked up her phone a dozen times that day, typing and deleting messages that all sounded inadequate, before finally sending nothing at all because what could she possibly say that would matter now? The wedding preparations intensified as summer approached, each decision feeling like another nail in the coffin of who Margaret used to be. She chose flowers she didn't care about, tasted cakes that all seemed equally tasteless, nodded along as her mother and the wedding planner discussed seating charts and color schemes that might as well have been planned for a stranger's celebration. Daniel was frequently absent during these preparations, busy with work, he never explained in detail. And Margaret was grateful for his absence because pretending to be happy was exhausting enough without having to pretend to be in love. The few times they were alone together, Daniel would talk at her rather than to her, sharing opinions about how their life would be structured, what social events she would be expected to attend, how she would need to cut ties with certain friends he deemed inappropriate for his wife. The way he said, "my wife," made Margaret feel like a possession being acquired rather than a partner being chosen, but she swallowed her discomfort and told herself this was normal. This was what marriage in their world looked like. This was the price of security and family approval. Her mother threw an engagement party that felt more like a coronation, the Whitmore estate filled with hundreds of guests, who came to see and be seen, to celebrate the union of two powerful families and speculate about the business empire that would result. Margaret wore a dress that cost more than most people earned in a year, white silk that made her look like a virgin sacrifice, and stood beside Daniel, accepting congratulations that felt like condolences. Halfway through the evening, she escaped to the garden, needing air and space away from the suffocating crowd, and found herself in the rose garden where she and Robert had once sat talking for hours during a family party she had sneaked him into. The memory hit her with such force that she had to sit down on the stone bench, her breath coming in short gasps, grief threatening to overwhelm the careful control she had maintained all night. That was where her mother found her, Catherine's face tight with disapproval as she took in her daughter's tears and shaking shoulders. "Pull yourself together, Margaret," her mother hissed, scanning the garden to ensure no guests had witnessed this breakdown. "This is everything we've worked for, everything you're supposed to want. Why are you crying on what should be the happiest night of your life?" Margaret looked up at her mother, really looked at her, seeing for the first time the deeply etched lines of dissatisfaction around Catherine's mouth, the brittle quality to her perfect appearance, the way her own wedding ring seemed to weigh down her hand like a shackle. "How happy are you, mother?" Margaret asked quietly, genuinely curious. "In your marriage, in your life of proper choices and appropriate connections, are you actually happy?" Catherine's face went white, then red, and for a moment Margaret thought she might actually get an honest answer. But then the mask slammed back into place, and her mother straightened her spine with visible effort. "Happiness is a luxury for people who can afford to be foolish," Catherine said coldly. "We have duty, legacy, security. That's worth far more than some fleeting emotion that fades with time. Now, fix your makeup and get back to your party. Your fiancé is looking for you." Margaret returned to the party and played her role perfectly, but something had shifted inside her, some fundamental understanding that she couldn't unknow. She looked around at all the wealthy, successful, perfectly dressed people filling her home and realized she couldn't identify a single one who seemed genuinely happy. They were comfortable, certainly, secure, and powerful and socially connected, but happiness, real joy, the kind she had felt waking up in Robert's cramped apartment with his arms around her, that seemed to be absent from every face she saw. Daniel found her and possessively wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close in a way that looked affectionate but felt controlling, and Margaret had to fight the urge to pull away. She caught her reflection in one of the ballroom's many mirrors and barely recognized the woman staring back. Perfectly coiffed and expensively dressed, but somehow less real than the girl who used to wear Robert's old shirts and eat cheap takeout and laugh until her stomach hurt. The Margaret in the mirror looked like her mother. Beautiful and cold and deeply, profoundly alone despite being surrounded by people. And the realization filled her with a terror so acute she thought she might be sick. That night, after all the guests had left and the staff had cleaned away the evidence of celebration, Margaret sat in her room and made a decision. She would go through with the wedding because backing out now would cause a scandal her family would never forgive, and she wasn't brave enough to face that fallout. But she would find Robert first, would track him down wherever he had gone and tell him the truth about why she had left, about the ultimatum and the fear and the weakness that had made her choose wrong. She wouldn't ask him to take her back because that ship had sailed and she had burned it to the waterline, but she needed him to know that the cruel things she had said weren't true. That he had been the best thing in her life and losing him was a wound that would never fully heal. With shaking hands, Margaret opened her laptop and began searching for any trace of where Robert Chin had gone, determined to find him before she married Daniel Morrison and closed that door forever. But the internet offered no answers. Robert had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed, and Margaret was left staring at her empty search results, feeling hope drain away like water through her fingers. The wedding was 3 weeks away when everything Margaret thought she knew shattered like glass. She was at her family's restaurant, ostensibly checking on preparations for the rehearsal dinner that would be held there, when she overheard a conversation that stopped her cold in the hallway outside her father's office. Daniel's voice carried through the partially open door, smooth and satisfied in a way that made her skin prickle with instinctive warning. It all worked exactly as I predicted, he was saying to someone, probably on his phone based on the one-sided nature of the conversation. The Chen kid never stood a chance, once I convinced Catherine that he was using Margaret for money. His voice took on a mocking quality that Margaret had never heard before, something cruel and pleased with itself that made her press closer to the wall, barely breathing. I had investigators follow him for months, documenting every time Margaret gave him money, every moment that could be twisted to look transactional rather than generous. Then it was just a matter of presenting the evidence in the right light, making it look like a pattern of manipulation, rather than a girlfriend helping her boyfriend through hard times. Margaret's blood turned to ice as Daniel continued, his words painting a picture of calculated manipulation that made her previous suffering seem almost naive in comparison. The best part was getting him to leave the university entirely. Daniel laughed, a sound completely devoid of genuine humor. I spread rumors through my fraternity connections that he had been expelled for academic dishonesty, made sure no one would hire him locally. Even had someone approach his family's business with bogus health code violations. I wanted him crushed, wanted him to disappear so completely that Margaret would never be tempted to go back. And it worked perfectly. She's been the model fiancée, docile and obedient exactly as she should be. The casual cruelty in his tone, the pride he took in destroying another person's life, made Margaret press her fist against her mouth to keep from crying out. She had known Daniel was cold, had sensed something off about him, but this level of calculated malice was beyond anything she had imagined. Her mother had known, she realized with dawning horror. Catherine had to have known because Daniel mentioned convincing her. Which meant her own mother had actively participated in this scheme to destroy the man Margaret loved and trap her in a marriage built on lies. The conversation continued, Daniel moving on to discuss post-wedding plans that made Margaret's stomach turn. Once we're married I'll have complete access to the Whitmore business network and capital, he said, matter-of-factly, treating their impending marriage like a corporate merger rather than a union of two people. Margaret's already proven, she'll do whatever her mother tells her to, so controlling her will be simple. We'll have the required 2 children for appearance's sake, but I'll maintain my own separate life. Honestly, I'm doing her a favor. Girls like that need to be managed by someone who understands how the world really works, otherwise they make foolish emotional decisions like she did with that poverty case. The dismissive way he referred to Robert, the casual assumption that Margaret would simply accept being controlled and cheated on, the complete absence of any affection or respect in his tone. It all coalesced into a rage so pure and hot that Margaret felt like she was burning from the inside out. This was the man her mother had chosen for her, the future she had sacrificed Robert to achieve, and the realization of how thoroughly she had been manipulated made her want to scream until her throat was raw. Margaret didn't confront Daniel immediately, some instinct for self-preservation telling her to gather information first, to understand the full scope of what had been done before revealing that she knew. She left the restaurant through a side exit and drove to her mother's house with her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Catherine was in her sitting room when Margaret walked in, without knocking. Her face still carefully composed in that expression of cool superiority that Margaret now recognized as a mask for something far more damaged underneath. "Tell me the truth," Margaret said without preamble. Her voice surprisingly steady despite the fury and grief warring in her chest. About Daniel, about Robert, about all of it. No more lies, no more manipulation, just the truth for once in your life. Her mother's composure cracked for just a moment, surprise and something that might have been guilt flickering across her features before the mask reasserted itself. "I don't know what you're talking about," Catherine said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Margaret laughed. A bitter sound that held no humor whatsoever. "I heard Daniel on the phone. Mother. I know what he did, what you helped him do. You destroyed Robert deliberately, systematically, and you let me believe it was my choice to walk away when really you just eliminated every other option." The confession that followed was worse than Margaret had imagined, her mother admitting with clinical detachment that yes, she had worked with Daniel to ensure Robert would leave and never return. Catherine justified it with the same arguments she had used before, claiming it was for Margaret's own good, that she was protecting her daughter from a life of struggle and disappointment. But as Margaret listened, she heard something else beneath the justifications, a deep well of her own regret and unhappiness that Catherine was trying to prevent her daughter from experiencing. Your father and I married for the right reasons, Catherine said quietly, staring at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. Same social class, same business interests, same understanding of how the world works. And we've built something successful together, something stable and profitable and respected. But Margaret. Her mother's voice cracked slightly. I haven't loved your father in 20 years. If I ever really did at all. Every day is a performance, every interaction carefully calculated, and I wake up feeling empty in ways I can't even articulate. I wanted better for you, wanted you to at least have the comfort of knowing you made the smart choice rather than wondering what if like I do. So yes, I manipulated you, and I'd do it again because watching you throw away everything for some boy would have destroyed me. Margaret stared at her mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in her life, a woman who had sacrificed everything real and genuine on the altar of social acceptance and financial security. And who was now trying to ensure her daughter made the same choice so she wouldn't have to face her regrets alone. The pity Margaret felt was almost overwhelming, but it was mixed with a fury that wouldn't be contained any longer. You didn't save me from anything, Margaret said, her voice shaking with the force of her emotion. You condemned me to the same empty life you've lived, and you destroyed a good man in the process because you couldn't stand to see me have what you never did. Robert loved me, actually loved me, not my name or my money or what I could do for him, just me. And I loved him in a way I will never love Daniel, in a way that made me better and braver and more myself than I've ever been before or since. You took that from both of us, and for what? For a marriage that will make me as miserable as you are, for the privilege of dying slowly inside a gilded cage like you've been doing for decades. I won't do it, Mother. I'm calling off the wedding. And if that means losing the family and the money and everything else, then so be it. At least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. The next 72 hours passed in a whirlwind of confrontations and revelations that left Margaret feeling like she was shedding an old skin, painful and necessary and long overdue. She called off the wedding in the most public way possible. Standing up at what was supposed to be her bridal shower in front of 200 guests and announcing that she would not be marrying Daniel Morrison, because he was a manipulative monster and she refused to spend her life as anyone's possession. The gasps and scandalized whispers that followed were music to her ears, as was the look of pure rage on Daniel's face when he received the news. He tried to threaten her, showing up at her family's estate with lawyers and demands, but Margaret had spent the previous 2 days gathering evidence of his manipulation with the help of a private investigator she hired. And the threat of exposing his schemes to the business community he so valued was enough to send him slinking away. Her mother didn't speak to her for a week, Catherine's silence more eloquent than any argument, but Margaret found she didn't care as much as she thought she would. The freedom of having made a choice based on her own values rather than fear was intoxicating, even if it came with consequences. But the hardest part remained, finding Robert and somehow making amends for the pain she had caused, even if reconciliation was impossible. Margaret had hired investigators to track him down, but the trail went cold after he left the country, and for months she heard nothing. She threw herself into work at her family's restaurant, taking on roles she had previously considered beneath her, actually learning the business from the ground up rather than just coasting on her family name. It was during one of these shifts, roughly 8 months after calling off her wedding, that Margaret encountered the delivery boy whose humiliation would eventually lead to the most important moment of her life. He was young, probably no more than 20, with nervous eyes and clothes that had been washed so many times they were nearly threadbare. He was carrying supplies through the main dining room, a route he shouldn't have taken but probably didn't know better. And in his nervousness he brushed against Margaret's dress, leaving a small smudge of dust on the pristine white fabric. The old Margaret, the one who had been raised to see service workers as invisible and interchangeable, would have ignored it, or perhaps politely asked him to be more careful. But the new Margaret, bitter and unhappy and taking out her self-hatred on anyone available, erupted with a fury that shocked even herself. The words that came out of her mouth were her mother's words, the toxic lessons of her childhood spilling out like poison, and she watched the boy's face crumble with shame and humiliation, while some distant part of her screamed that this was wrong. That she was becoming exactly what she hated. She raised her hand to slap him, riding a wave of displaced anger and grief that had nothing to do with a dust mark, and everything to do with the mess she had made of her life. When that voice cut through the air like a knife through silk. That's enough, Margaret. She turned, and the world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. Robert Chen stood in the entrance of the restaurant, backlit by afternoon sun streaming through the glass doors, and he was completely transformed from the struggling student she had known. He wore wealth like a second skin now, a charcoal suit that was clearly custom-tailored, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than the delivery boy made in 3 months. A watch that glinted on his wrist with the kind of subtle expense that only the truly wealthy recognized. But it was his face that struck her most, harder and colder than she remembered, the warmth she had loved, replaced by something that looked almost like contempt. He walked toward her with measured steps, each footfall deliberate, and Margaret found she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Could only stand frozen while her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. When he reached them, Robert's attention went first to the delivery boy, his voice gentling in a way it never did when he looked at Margaret. "Are you all right?" he asked the young man, who nodded mutely, clearly confused about what was happening. Robert pulled out his wallet and handed the boy several bills. Far more than was necessary. "Take the rest of the day off," he said quietly. "No one should have to tolerate being treated like that, especially not for minimum wage." The delivery boy fled, and suddenly Margaret and Robert were alone despite the crowded restaurant, everyone else fading into insignificance as they faced each other for the first time in 5 years. He looked at her with those dark eyes that used to see her so clearly, but now they showed nothing but a distant politeness that hurt worse than anger would have. "Hello, Margaret," he said, his tone neutral and controlled. "You're looking well." The mundane greeting felt obscene given everything between them, all the history and pain and love that had curdled into something unrecognizable. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but nothing came out except a small broken sound that might have been his name. Robert's jaw tightened slightly, the only indication that her presence affected him at all, and he continued as if she hadn't made a sound. "I'm actually here on business," he said, conversationally, as though they were strangers making small talk. "I'm considering purchasing this restaurant as part of my company's expansion into the American market. I assume you're still connected to the ownership, so perhaps we can discuss terms." His words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to establish distance and transform their relationship into something purely transactional. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to break down in front of him when she had no right to his sympathy or comfort. "You want to buy my family's restaurant," she repeated, her voice sounding hollow and far away. Robert nodded, his expression never changing. Still that terrible polite mask that revealed nothing. "Among others," he confirmed. "I've built a rather successful hospitality and entertainment empire over the past few years. Maybe you've heard of it, Chin Global Enterprises. We specialize in acquiring struggling legacy businesses and revitalizing them with modern management and capital investment." The implication was clear, her family's restaurant was struggling, something Margaret knew was true even if it wounded her pride to hear him say it so casually. But more than that, the implication was that Robert had succeeded beyond even his own ambitious dreams, had become exactly the kind of powerful, successful man her mother had insisted he could never be. And he had done it all without Margaret, maybe even because she had left him with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Before Margaret could formulate a response, another woman appeared at Robert's side, elegant and confident in a way that made Margaret feel instantly inferior despite her designer clothes and perfect makeup. The woman was beautiful, but more than that she was self-assured, moving through the world like she had every right to take up space and demand attention. She slipped her hand into Robert's with easy familiarity, and Margaret felt something die inside her chest as she recognized the wedding ring on the woman's finger, matching the one Robert wore. "Oh," the woman said, her smile friendly and genuine in a way that made Margaret want to scream, "You must be Margaret Whitmore. Robert's told me so much about you. I'm Melissa, his wife." The word wife echoed in Margaret's head like a gunshot, final and devastating, confirmation that she had lost him not just temporarily but permanently. Irrevocably. Melissa extended her free hand for a handshake, completely oblivious to the way Margaret's world was crumbling, and Margaret took it automatically. Her social training overriding the shock that had turned her body to stone. "It's nice to meet you," Margaret managed, her voice remarkably steady given that she felt like she was dying inside. Melissa beamed, clearly delighted by something Margaret didn't understand. "Robert's been looking forward to this meeting," she said warmly. "He has such respect for your family's business history, and he's excited about the possibility of working together. When he told me you two knew each other in university, I thought what a wonderful coincidence." Margaret's eyes snapped to Robert's face, searching for any sign that he had told his wife the truth about their relationship, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "We had some classes together," Robert said smoothly, the lie of omission so casual it took Margaret's breath away. Small world. Running into old classmates like this. The dismissal was complete, their 3 years together reduced to being vague acquaintances, all that love and pain, and history erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Margaret wanted to scream. Wanted to grab him and demand he acknowledge what they had been to each other. But what right did she have to demand anything when she was the one who had walked away? Who had said those terrible things, who had chosen comfort over courage, The business discussion that followed was surreal. Robert laying out his offer with professional detachment, while Melissa occasionally interjected with questions that demonstrated her own sharp business acumen. Margaret learned that Melissa was actually Robert's business partner as well as his wife, that they had built Chin Global Enterprises together from nothing. That she was the strategic mind behind many of their most successful acquisitions. The way Robert looked at Melissa, when she spoke, with respect, and admiration and genuine affection, made Margaret's heart crack further. Because she recognized that look. He used to look at her like that once upon a time. Melissa was everything Margaret had failed to be. Brave enough to stand beside Robert publicly. Confident enough to build something with him rather than expecting him to build something for her. Secure enough in herself that she didn't need the validation of society or family to know her own worth. The comparison was devastating, and Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had no one to blame but herself. The meeting concluded with Robert promising to have his lawyers draw up a formal offer, his handshake brief and impersonal. Treating Margaret like any other business contact rather than someone who had once known every inch of his body and soul. As he and Melissa prepared to leave, Margaret found her voice one last time, calling out his name in a way that made him pause and turn back. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate and far too late, but needing to be spoken anyway. "For everything, for how I treated you, for the things I said, for not being brave enough. I was wrong about so much, and you deserved better than what I gave you." Robert looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and for just a second, Margaret saw past his careful control to the pain underneath. The scars she had left that had healed but would never fully disappear. "I know you are," he said quietly, his voice holding a sadness that made her want to cry. "But Margaret, apologies don't undo the past, they just acknowledge it. You made your choices, I made mine, and we both have to live with the consequences. I've forgiven you because holding on to anger was poisoning me. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I've made peace with what happened and moved on. I hope you can do the same." He turned to leave again, but Melissa hesitated, looking at Margaret with something that might have been pity or understanding. "For what it's worth," she said gently, "I know loving someone and losing them is one of the hardest things a person can experience. But sometimes losing what we think we want is how we find out who we really are. I hope you find your way to happiness, truly." Then she followed Robert out into the sunshine, leaving Margaret standing alone in the restaurant that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, surrounded by the ghosts of all her wrong choices. That night, Margaret went home and finally let herself grieve properly, crying until she was hollow and exhausted, mourning not just Robert but the version of herself that had loved him. The girl who had been brave enough to cross social boundaries and risk everything for connection. That girl was gone, killed by fear and social pressure and her own weakness, and Margaret didn't know if she could ever get her back. But watching Robert walk away with Melissa, seeing the life he had built without her, the happiness he had found with someone worthy of him, Margaret realized something crucial. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she could choose differently going forward. She could become someone who treated others with kindness regardless of their social status, someone who stood up against injustice, even when it was uncomfortable, someone who made choices based on values rather than fear. It wouldn't bring Robert back, wouldn't repair what she had broken, but it might make her someone she could actually respect when she looked in the mirror. And perhaps that was the only redemption available to her, not forgiveness from those she had hurt, but the slow painful work of becoming better than she had been. The acquisition of the Whitmore restaurant by Chin Global Enterprises took 6 months to finalize. 6 months, during which Margaret saw Robert regularly in professional settings and slowly learned to accept the reality of what she had lost. Each meeting was polite and businesslike, Robert treating her with the same courteous detachment he showed all his business associates. Never referencing their past or acknowledging the tension that hummed beneath every interaction. Melissa was often present, her warmth and genuine kindness making it impossible for Margaret to hate her. Even though part of Margaret desperately wished she could blame this woman for taking what should have been hers. But the truth was that Melissa hadn't taken anything. Margaret had thrown Robert away, and Melissa had simply been wise enough to recognize his value and brave enough to stand beside him. The contrast between them haunted Margaret during sleepless nights, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about the person she had been, and the person she had become. The final papers were signed on a gray Tuesday in November. Exactly 5 years after Margaret had walked into Robert's apartment and destroyed their relationship with carefully chosen lies. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, though she doubted Robert even remembered the date. Why would he when he had built an entire life that had nothing to do with her? After the signing, there was a small celebration with the restaurant staff, Robert addressing them with genuine respect and laying out his vision for revitalizing the business while keeping its legacy intact. Margaret watched him command the room with natural authority, saw how the employees responded to his leadership with enthusiasm rather than the nervous deference they had always shown her family, and felt a complicated mix of pride and grief that this remarkable man had once been hers, and she had been too foolish to appreciate it. When the event ended and people began filtering out, Margaret found herself alone with Robert for the first time since that initial confrontation, Melissa having stepped away to take a phone call. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid, 5 years of pain and growth and transformation that had happened in parallel universes that would never intersect again. Margaret knew this was likely her last chance to say the things that had been building inside her. To offer not excuses but acknowledgement, to give Robert the closure he probably didn't need, but she desperately did. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice soft but steady, "about how apologies acknowledge the past but don't undo it. You're right, of course, nothing I say now can change what I did or repair the damage I caused. But I need you to know that breaking up with you, saying those horrible things, it wasn't because any of it was true. My mother gave me an ultimatum. Choose you and lose everything. Or choose my family and security. And I chose wrong, Robert. I chose comfort over courage. And I've regretted it every single day since." Robert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise that she was finally telling him the truth. Perhaps pain at the confirmation that she had chosen deliberately rather than simply falling out of love. Margaret continued, needing to get it all out before her courage failed. "Daniel, my ex-fiancé. He manipulated everything. He convinced my mother you were using me, had investigators follow us to make our relationship look transactional, even sabotaged your opportunities here so you would leave. I didn't know any of that until months later, but it doesn't matter because even without his manipulation, I still chose wrong. I let fear make my decisions, and I hurt you in ways I can never make right." Robert was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he processed this information. Finally, he spoke, his voice thoughtful rather than angry. "I suspected something like that," he admitted. "The timing of everything, the sudden change in your mother's attitude, the way opportunities dried up so quickly. But Margaret, even knowing that doesn't change the fundamental issue. You didn't trust me enough to tell me what was happening, didn't believe in us enough to fight for what we had. When things got hard, you pushed me away instead of pulling me closer. That's not love, not the kind that lasts anyway." His words were devastating precisely because they were true, spoken without malice but with the clarity of someone who had spent years analyzing a painful situation and reaching honest conclusions. Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks that she made no effort to hide. "You're absolutely right," she whispered. "I didn't love you the way you deserved to be loved, with courage and trust and commitment. I loved you the way I was capable of loving at that time, which was conditional and fearful and ultimately selfish. And you found someone who could love you properly, who was everything I should have been and wasn't. Melissa is remarkable, Robert, and seeing you two together, the way she supports you and you respect her. It's made me realize what real partnership looks like. I'm genuinely happy for you. Even though it breaks my heart that I wasn't the one who got to build that life with you." Robert's expression softened slightly, the hard edges of his control relaxing enough to show the man underneath. Still kind despite everything. Still capable of compassion, even towards someone who had hurt him deeply. "I appreciate you telling me the truth," he said gently. "And for what it's worth, I don't think you're the same person you were 5 years ago. I've watched you these past months, the way you've thrown yourself into actually working at the restaurant, how you treat the staff with respect instead of contempt. The way you stood up to that woman who was harassing the busboy last month. You're trying to be better, and that counts for something." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, not forgiveness exactly because she didn't deserve that, but perhaps permission to forgive herself, eventually. To accept that people can grow and change, even if that growth doesn't erase past mistakes. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you know." Robert smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time since he had walked back into her life, and for just a moment Margaret saw the boy she had fallen in love with in that library so many years ago. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Margaret," he said sincerely. "Real happiness, the kind that comes from being authentically yourself rather than playing a role. You deserve that, everyone does." Melissa returned then, slipping her hand into Robert's with the easy intimacy of two people completely in sync, and something in Margaret's heart finally let go. Releasing the desperate hope she hadn't even realized she had been holding on to. This was really goodbye, not the angry painful ending of 5 years ago but a mature peaceful closure that acknowledged what they had been to each other while accepting what they could never be again. As Robert and Melissa left together, their heads bent close in conversation, Margaret felt the weight of the past finally begin to lift from her shoulders. She couldn't change what she had done, couldn't reclaim what she had lost, but she could move forward differently, wiser, and kinder and more intentional about the person she wanted to become. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She went to volunteer at a community center in the poor neighborhood where Robert had grown up. The same neighborhood she had once looked down on with unconscious contempt. She served meals and listened to stories and helped where she could, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Not toward Robert because that door was closed, but toward a version of herself she could actually respect. Months passed, then a year, and Margaret slowly built a new life on the foundation of hard-won self-awareness and genuine growth. She took over daily operations of the family restaurant under Chin Global's ownership, working long hours and learning the business from the ground up in a way her privilege had never required before. She returned to school part-time to study social work, wanting to understand and help the communities she had once dismissed. She began dating a kind man named Thomas who worked as a teacher, someone whose lack of wealth would have horrified the old Margaret but who made her laugh and challenged her to be better and never let her get away with falling back into old patterns of entitlement. Her mother eventually came around. Their relationship forever changed, but not completely destroyed. Catherine admitting in a rare moment of vulnerability that watching Margaret choose her own path with courage had forced her to confront her own regrets. Margaret never stopped thinking about Robert, but the nature of those thoughts transformed from painful longing into something more like gratitude, thankfulness for what he had taught her about real love and authentic living. Even if she had learned those lessons too late to keep him. She heard about him occasionally through business channels and mutual acquaintances. His company's continued success, the philanthropic work he and Melissa did, supporting scholarship programs for underprivileged students, the announcement 2 years later that they were expecting their first child. Each piece of news brought a pang of loss, but also genuine happiness for him, pride that someone so good had found the life he deserved. Margaret sent a baby gift when their daughter was born, a children's book about courage and kindness with a simple note inside that read, "For teaching me that becoming better is always possible, even when it's too late to undo the past. Wishing your family every happiness." She didn't expect a response and didn't receive one. But 3 weeks later, a donation was made in her name to the community center, where she volunteered, accompanied by an anonymous note that said simply, "The best apology is changed behavior. Keep going." Margaret framed that note and hung it in her office, a reminder of the man she had loved and lost, the mistakes she had made, and the person she was committed to becoming. 5 years after their final conversation, Margaret attended a charity gala where Robert and Melissa were being honored for their philanthropic work. She went with Thomas, who knew the whole story and supported her attendance as a symbol of how far she had come. Across the crowded ballroom, Margaret's eyes met Robert's, and they exchanged a smile, friendly and warm but no longer weighted with pain or regret. They had both moved on, built good lives with people who loved them well, transformed their past suffering into motivation for making the world slightly better. Later that night, as Margaret and Thomas drove home through city streets that sparkled with lights, he asked if she was okay, if seeing Robert with his family had hurt. Margaret thought about it honestly before answering. It did hurt, she admitted, but not in the way it used to. Now it hurts like an old injury that aches when the weather changes, present but manageable, a reminder of lessons learned rather than opportunities lost. I loved him, probably always will in some way, but I also love the life I'm building now, the person I'm becoming. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is refusing to accept the worst version of yourself, forcing you to become better even if they're not there to see it. Robert did that for me, and I'll be grateful for it until the day I die. Thomas squeezed her hand, understanding in his eyes, and Margaret looked out at the city she had grown up in but was finally learning to see clearly, full of people with their own struggles and dreams and value regardless of how much money they had or where they came from. She had lost Robert, had thrown away something precious through her own fear and weakness, but she had found something else in the wreckage, herself, flawed and growing, and, finally becoming someone worthy of the love she had once been too broken to accept. And perhaps that was the real ending to their story, not reconciliation or revenge, but two people who had loved each other learning to love themselves and others better because of that love, even after it ended. Margaret could live with that. Could find peace in knowing that even her greatest mistake had eventually led to becoming a better person. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten, and for the first time in years, Margaret was excited to see what she would write there.